record. Yep. Okay, you guys are all good to go. Sorry about that.
Okay, great. Well, without further ado, I invite the first affirmative speaker to speak to the motion. Here.
Okay. Can I confirm that I'm audible loud and clear?
Yes, you are. Thanks.
Okay, cool. Give me 10 seconds and then I'll just begin. Okay. All right, starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, it sucks to be a woman and grew up watching movies where women have little to no depth in their character development, when all of them are these two-dimensional characters, developing around even like from princess stories and all these kind of stuff where just women are submissive and they have to like have some prince come and save them, or women just like sort of caring mothers, all of those kind of things. I think it becomes sort of dimensional in that sort of direction and lacks that sort of depth and character that we require, because I don't think women in all instances can be generalized in their characters in terms of all of them wanting to be mothers, in terms of all of them wanting to be like just nice people or like really complacent and like probably submissive to their male counterparts, right? Why then is the source of fear and the portrayal of women being someone that can be fearful important in society? I think first and foremost, before we understand all of this, let's get into some characterization, right? Because the problem within society today is that a large chunk of these structures are male dominant, wherein you expect women to be complacent and have no form of unique opinion of their own. But even if they have these unique opinions, you see them lack the driving force or power to channelize these opinions and make reasonable amount of change in society that can then get behind these opinions and like show why these opinions even matter, whether these women are strong enough to like stand by their opinions, even if they're sort of new and like unforgivingly, unapologetically themselves. I think what then is this portrayal of women as fear, like source of fear in these films, right? So take the example of Miranda Priestly in Devil Wears Prada. This is literally an unapologetic woman that doesn't give a fucking damn about people having to feel sorry for themselves and not being ready to be in the capitalist world, where a large chunk of men are CEOs in these big companies. Miranda Priestly goes ahead and shows to be someone that knows how to be unapologetic herself when she is not sort of pretentious to try and cater to people and their specific needs and show basic things like ethics of care and all of these things, while women can still probably be caring and complacent and all of these things. It shows that there is a diverse set of women that probably have their own opinions and can be something that you should fear for, right? Because in a large chunk of society, the current problem is that a lot of men tend to think, and a lot of people in society tend to think, that women lack the kind of power to be able to make opinions, but women also kind of lack the kind of power to be able to sort of fear people. That is primarily the reason that a large chunk of people in society are able to take advantage of these issues where women are probably complacent, cannot sort of voice for themselves, cannot sort of voice their issues, and cannot sort of create the changes that are required for themselves. So what then do these fear sort of situations look like, right? Because insofar as you're strong about your opinions, insofar as you show that there's some sort of countering narrative that you're creating, when you have all of these movies existing in society that show women to be a certain way, there's a certain amount of diversity in sort of character and certain amount of diversity in the narratives that exist in society that these movies create. That's the first argument coming from side government, why this counter narrative is important. You'd probably, as the feminist women, still support women in other sort of roles and in other sort of movies where you show women to be in other different characters and have different sort of character developments, but you'd additionally also support the portrayal of women as a source of fear in these films. Why is this important to do, right? Because when you show these women as like being powerful, and when you show that these are women that are not to be messed around with, what are the things that are like synonymous with fear, right? Because the only person that you can actively be afraid of is either A, that their kind of actions actively impact the actions and like outcomes of your life, and like how then you go ahead and continue to make these actions. But secondly, you see them as someone that has the power to create change, right? Because insofar as someone who's having these opinions and doesn't have the kind of power to affect you, or doesn't have the power to change things around you, you have no reason to be afraid of them. That's the primary reason that you get to have like oppression against them, and that you kind of get to have your say over them, right? So when you specifically have fearful characters in your story, and when you specifically have these characters, you know these are characters that have strong challenging opinions, but these are also characters that can change the course of direction. These are dynamic characters that also go ahead and impact other characters around them. For example, in the case of like Miranda Priestly, I don't specifically remember the name of the Anne Hathaway's character, but that's like someone that Miranda Priestly chooses to change within the movie, right? Because of her strong character and the way that she's sort of projecting onto others, she's able to change the way women around her think, right? So when Anne Hathaway like walks into the movie, she's generally very weak and sort of unsure of herself. But these kind of characters are able to show specific characters that you require in like your sort of personality, which is like being strong-willed, being unapologetic about yourself. And all of these things become important for two specific reasons. One, insofar as a large chunk of society sees women as being incapable of being able to channel their opinions, whenever they have like these unique opinions, you're less likely to believe why they'll be able to stand up for themselves. So insofar as that is the case, you are less likely to see where their power really comes from, right? Because when men and like other people in society also start to see women as being weaker, and women like something that you can like sort of control and something that you don't have to be afraid of, you're more likely to go ahead and enact your opinions and enact your personality traits over them, right? But what is the importance of them being then fearful? So one, so when you go ahead and see something you fear of, you start to probably respect them a little. You probably start to see that this is someone that I should not be messing up with, right? Why is this crucial? So even if you take for the worst cases of example, like maybe you take Dolores Umbridge, who's seen as probably aggressive, right? I still don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I'm not so sure even if this fearful nature makes these women kind of have a villain character, why that's necessarily a bad thing, right? Because even in these villain characters, you get to see a large chunk of character development, as opposed to seeing this one-dimensional character that you're just going to see like repetitively happen. But secondly, when you see these kind of women come up in these movies, and to support how this manifests in society is the more important thing to note in this debate, right? Because how is this likely to manifest in society, and what are things that people should fear of, right? Because men currently in society aren't afraid of the consequences of harming women in serious way, right? They don't see the kind of harms that could come about. How is this likely to then manifest into society? So when women are shown as like probably characters that you can fear of, you can see that the kind of power that comes from them being able to push into positions of power, and also the kind of power that comes with them being into like further positions of like being able to channelize like unique opinions that are probably different from these things, right? This sort of creates this role modeling perspective, because a large chunk of women, insofar as you see mostly men being CEOs, you don't think that's a nature that women can probably accomplish. You think that women are more likely to be complacent as to their like secondary to their male counterparts. They have to please them, they have to do all of these things, and they probably have to do some things that will make them happy, as opposed to things that will upset them, right? The bigger derivative of this is that you'd upset men and then you'd lose your respect in society. But when you say that these women are being feared, or these are women that men still respect, and these are women that like men have to like listen to, that's something that creates a sort of role modeling perspective for these women. This is crucial in two amount of ways, right? One, insofar as women in general don't have a virtue or seeing like what can be possible for them, in that aspect they're like less likely to take risks upon themselves and see what can possibly be done for them, right? But secondly, insofar as you try to create these perspectives, you show the diversity of like nature and the character that can exist within society as a whole, right? But even if these women are to come across as villainous, the problem with that is still like charitable on op, right? Because op can't come up and say that, hey, if you show these women to be fearful, it's going to create problems with like being able to give them power, because you think that they'll like probably take power away from you and all of these kind of things. I think a large chunk of the backlash that comes against like giving women power, and probably seeing that if you give them power, they'll probably fuck over other people that are currently in power. Most people that are in power are slightly defensive of their power in the first place, right? So men that are probably in power probably don't want to let that power go off, and they're not really going to challenge that anyway in the first place, right? But when you specifically, the second reason that you don't want to give these women power is that you don't necessarily see them as being able to control that power, right? Because with power and like with being able to sort of able to control things, you significantly have to take these tough decisions. You won't be able to take these tough decisions if you're too worried about like pleasing people all the fucking time, right? And that can only be mitigated insofar as you show that these women are feared because they don't give a fuck about trying to please people all the time. This is important in showing two things. One, insofar as you're not this pleasing people kind of category, you show that you're able to make decisions for the greater good as a whole. And that's a good thing in terms of being able to be selfish for yourself, being able to create that kind of change that you require. Because insofar as all of this pleasing people is required, you're not able to do the kind of things that you require for yourself. Couldn't be more proud to propose. I'm sorry I went over time.
That's right. I thank the speaker very much for their speech. And yeah, sorry, just I forgot to note in intros, we won't be writing anything after 8 minutes 15, of course. But I now would like to invite the first negative speaker to open their team's case. Here.
Hello, hello. Can I be heard?
Yes, all good.
Great. My POI preference is no POIs because of this format. Hello. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, and 1. The Gov case line is essentially, we're tired of women's rights. Now it's time to advocate for women's wrongs. What depictions of women would OP instead support? So we would support strong female leads that are sources of hope and inspiration rather than sources of fear, like Jo from Little Women, Hermione Granger, and Harry Potter, even Nanny from Lilo. A woman can be in power without terrorizing her underlings, without threatening to kill them, etc. We say dominant support comes in the form of platforming it, increasing demand for it, and we would rather increase demand for positive depictions of women that don't make everybody scared. Some brief rebuttal before I move to the argument. The first rebuttal is they say, in general, women currently lack power, and people who are feared tend to have power. So we want to normalize women being in positions of power and being respected and authoritative. The first problem with this is they just say that it's good to depict them more without understanding the fact that creating fear makes them less desirable to be in power, which is when the women you give power overwork their interns, create abusive working standards. They create reasons to not put these women in power. Their preemptive response to this is one to say people are already defensive when in power, but this misunderstands the degree to which you would have to be terrible as a boss in order to create fear, which is you would literally have to overwork your interns, send them to like Bolivia or something. You would have to make their life basically terrible and be actively vindictive as opposed to just defensive. The second preemption is to say, oh, but you need to be able to control this power. People who tend to be feared tend to have not a good grip on power or tend to let the power go to their head. It's just like, as an observation, it doesn't seem like you're the most controlled or composed person if you're making other people afraid of you. The second is the consequence of generally harming other people, generally making this happen, is that it's not just harming these women, right? It's also harming many other characters. So it's like the consequence of actually putting them into power is just harming people in general. So even if theoretically they could be respected, theoretically they could potentially be a good leader, the whole point is it's not just that harming women is dangerous because women could be something that you could be afraid of, but that being in the same workplace as these women, potentially having them in power in the first place is scary, and so there's an attempt to oust them. So they miss totally the ball on what the reaction of people will be, and that's just precisely why we would rather have other depictions of women in power as opposed to them specifically being sources of fear. Argument 1. Their narrative tangibly worsens perceptions of women. This argument has 3 levels. The first level is that Hollywood tends it badly and tends to exacerbate negative stereotypes of women when it's women who are villains and sources of fear, and Gov is forced to work with existing source material that they have to uplift or platform. This is terrible for 3 sub-reasons. The first reason is that sources of fear will be depicted in a negative light in order for you to sympathize with the hero, in order for you to feel good about the arc of the story ending in a certain way, which means they emphasize certain bad traits like women being bitchy, being shrill, being vain, etc. And the second level is that certain stereotypical characters get highlighted due to what's easy for Hollywood to do and what is most sensational, what is most catering to the lowest common denominator, which means the existing movement Gov has to defend and the existing support Gov has to defend goes primarily to the stereotypical Hollywood depictions that tend to put women specifically in a bad light due to the negative stereotypes that they play upon in order to become a source of fear, namely that they're domineering in the workplace, that they tend to be irrational, etc. They tend to be vain. But the third and final thing is that the sexism itself of the movie industry as a male-dominated space, it means that even if there are some positive depictions where women are feared and at the same time respected respected. These are not the depictions that you will typically see, and this will typically gravitate towards the worst one. So Gov has a very, very high burden already to prove that these movies even exist in the first place to be respected. The second level is that even if Hollywood does it well, emergent stereotypes of the process of doing this means that the understanding and stereotypes will be bad. The first sublevel is that the premise of fear generates a gut reaction, which is effective in priming people to be uncomfortable of women in power, which means that when you see this person in power and you fear like they will abuse you, you feel like they will do bad things to you, not only do you be primed to not put the next woman in power in the first place, but you'll also do your best to conspire in order to make sure that this person doesn't have power over you, etc. Which means not only are we actively worsening the prospects of future women in the workplace, etc., but we're also jeopardizing the ability for existing women in power to exercise that power, because there are increasing amounts of regulations and checks and balances the way to make life very hard for them. Secondly, is that the dominant nature of the character is that even if it's done well, right, the main thing that will stand out is not the nuance of the character, but actually whether or not this character is a source of fear. By necessity, you cannot understand their motivations. They can't be a nuanced depiction, because the more nuanced they are, the harder it will be to fear them, because you understand them well and even more. So maybe Gov wants three-dimensional characters that are very nice and very nuanced. The problem is that the construction of that character can never be in such a way, because otherwise they would not be a source of fear. The third and last level for this whole argument is that, comparatively speaking, even if their narrative is good, our narrative is better off in terms of the use of resources of what movements the platform. They may say we want to support both narratives, but there's a very limited amount of time, a limited amount of airtime, as well as mental bandwidth that people have, and just generally, what do we see as a dominant depiction? You can only really have one portrayal in that broad mental space anyway. And for this, our comparative alternative that we proposed in the beginning already, of heroes, of strong female leads that inspire and provide hope, is better for three reasons. The first is that these heroes and leads are always preferable, since it's easy to sympathize with these people, since they're much easier to get along with, which just means that you're more amenable to them being in power in the first place, because not only can they have the ability to be respected because they're a hero, because they're a source of inspiration, that actual source of inspiration is a positive influence on other people. Number two is that even if there are stereotypes, these stereotypes are not things that we will ostracize them for anymore, which means we convert these stereotypes to a positive influence on people. So being a type A personality, for example, for Hermione, has many benefits to the team's success against, I don't know, Voldemort, or for example, Jo being strong-willed, allowing her to reach her dreams, showing that these negative stereotypes that would be very bad on government can be twisted in opposition to show positive influence on people. But thirdly and finally is that it's just better for the acting industry. These leads tend to get paid more, etc. They tend to have more resources, and they also tend to get subjected to less hate crimes and death threats, because the character is hated so much, it's feared so much, whereas if they're seen as a hero, they're much more likely to get support from the actors and the fan base. The conclusion of this argument is quite simple. Number one is that they do a net bad. So even if our narrative does nothing, it is substantially better than actively worsening the perceptions of women through some unclear mechanism that maybe if we support something, eventually somehow people will realize it's okay to put women in power, when there are very clear and pressing other alternatives that are good for people. Number two is that it's particularly damaging since it's the feminist movement doing it, which is seen as a credible influence on what women should be like, which means now on the ground it's much harder to convince people to support and believe in the feminist movement. But number three is that social perceptions also get substantially worse, particularly for vulnerable women. When they ask themselves the question, is it okay to vote in a woman into office? When they ask themselves the question, is it okay to let their daughter go to work? Should you, for example, promote a woman in the workplace? These are the questions that they will be asking themselves, and they'll be implicitly primed by the reaction that women are untrustworthy to put in positions of power, maybe not because they can't handle the power, but now because of government bench, now because they cannot be trusted with that power, even if they could theoretically use it well. The second argument is that this is also bad for the feminist movement's general strength. So even if you believe that the net narrative is a wash, then what's really, really important is how the feminist movement portrays itself and is viewed by both women and other people on the ground. The first is that you're typically going to lose followers and support by a massive amount. Number one is that people just don't want to self-identify as someone that is feared. Not only is it deeply unpleasant to be feared, because of the fact it's deeply unpleasant to be hated, you don't want to be afraid all the time that your position is going to be taken from you, etc. It's like you'll get all these glares and it won't be easy to make friends, for example. The second thing is that even if you want to self-identify, it's hard to join the movement, especially if you're in a developing country where your options for political activism might be restricted by, for example, your parents or social stigma, which just means if the primary depiction of these people are, for example, man-haters, or if they're people that are really, really bad or terrible, then it's much harder for you to even opt into these things in the first place, which means not only is it harder to itself activate many of the benefits from the first argument, it's also more hard to do other very important things like vote for a certain policy because they don't self-identify with the feminist movement anymore. But the second observation is that even if this is well-intentioned, this will still be massively caricaturized and substantially weaken the feminist movement's power in response to more Republican right-wing groups. Like, they can say that the feminist movement wants to take away your liberty, and now will, one, have credible evidence to sway people, but two is that those who actually dislike the characters will have also a strong reason to not support the feminist movement. So when they say they'll do it anyway, yes, they might do it anyway, but it will actually be effective as a policy to disarm and dismantle the feminist movement on government bench now that they have the ammunition to do so in the first place. At the end of this speech, it is quite clear. Number one, this is not a good strategy. Two, this makes life of women worse off. And number three is that this drastically destroys the perception of women, particularly the most vulnerable who need to get promoted, who need to be in positions of power. Negate.
All right, I thank the speaker very much for their speech and now invite the second affirmative speaker to continue their team's case here.
Yep. Am I audible?
Yes, thanks.
All right, great. I'll just start a timer for myself. Start in 3, 2, 1. Current portrayal of women as characters of fear is something which is symmetric on both sides, which is to say, if this debate doesn't really happen and nobody does anything, it will continue. There will be Devil Wears Prada 1, 2, 3, 4, and all the parts will be met, and similar movies would be made in our paradigm. So that is symmetric. So if their argument is really about things like Hollywood doing things which are stereotypical, they want to make a male character in which the woman is someone who is fear-mongering, and they want to make a hero out of a male character, all of those things will literally continue in both of the paradigm. That cannot be the metric of this debate, because the delta itself is not there at a point at which these characters continue. Difference, however, is what the feminist movement does about it. Firstly, how do you exactly deal with the Hollywood stereotypical characters and so on? Multiple ideas for this. Firstly, we think that at a moment which the feminist movement literally supports this, it allows the feminist movement to seep into how exactly these characters are written. Why this is likely to be important? Because in their world, when the feminist movement does nothing, it is male writers and male people who necessarily shape the way in which these characters are written. They necessarily decide how exactly they want to portray this idea of fear and so on. The moment when feminists support it, you necessarily get more amount of women writers and more inclusion of the feminist movement itself in the process of writing these characters and the narratives and the story around these characters particularly well. Why this is likely to be important? Because if they want to show things like stereotypically fear and how exactly does it happen, you show the layers of why that fear particularly occurs. The fact that a particular woman character necessarily is supposed to project fear, and it's absolutely unapologetic because they felt neglected towards their life because of the fact that they are a minority in an industry which is just generally male dominated. All of those reasons and all of the nuances of why exactly you're unapologetic, why you're a character which just projects fear, necessarily allows you to show the nuances of this kind of people. This can only happen when the feminist movement supports it rather than ignores the thing as a whole. But secondly, and more importantly, they said that it creates stereotypes. Let's flip this, right? I think that's an absolute good thing, because notice the stereotypes which currently exist in the society right now. The current existing stereotypes about women is that women are supposed to be empathetic. Women are supposed to have emotions, and they are supposed to stay at home and take care of their children. They're supposed to do both of the things. If they're going to work, they're supposed to be a supermom who really have to take care of the houses as well. These are pre-existing stereotypes in which women are expected to be empathetic and so on. Why then the stereotype which we generally want to create via supporting these kind of movies is necessarily important? Two key reasons. A, we think that more often than not, women can be characters in which they are unapologetic in real life as well. They necessarily do not have anything to look forward to. But B, and more importantly, we want stereotypes to necessarily counter this particular stereotypes which are already existing in the society. We probably want to tell them that women are not supposed to be empathetic all the freaking time. They're supposed to be unapologetic at times as well. We think this stereotypical creation of the stereotypical itself, which David says is something which is extremely bad, we think that's absolutely a good thing because it creates counter stereotypes. This allows for women to opt in and opt out of the stereotype. This allows for people to think differently. But lastly, and more importantly, right, they think that association of the fear itself is itself a bad thing. Like, why? Like, it just sounds negative to think about fear being extremely bad. I'm unsure why they're likely to be feared. Like, I am afraid of my mom because I think that like she has power over how she controls my life, right? I'm afraid of my boss because he can probably like fire me. All of those reasons why I necessarily fear these people or they project fear over me is because they are in positions of power. I think that necessarily can be both good or bad. I think that's a good nuance to have. Why that is likely to be the case? Because it goes back to the stereotypical argument again. Insofar that you believe that women are supposed to be empathetic and so on, and not unapologetic, not someone who gets the shit done regardless of the consequences, you necessarily are not seeing them as people who are supposed can be leaders and so on. That never happens on their paradigm because the pre-existing narratives which literally exist in their paradigm is movies about things like hope and optimism, where you necessarily characterize this woman to be always mechanisms of things like empathy. At that point of time, you cannot really imagine to be people who can necessarily be people who necessarily fear. Where do you associate these kind of things, right? You associate this in positions of power, especially in like companies and so on. You do not want your CEO to be a pushover. You want him someone who is someone who is feared, who cannot be rolled over in board meetings, who cannot go through a hostile takeover. You want this association to be part of your politicians at a point at which you want them to vote, because you want someone to represent you who will necessarily fight for your like rights, regardless of whatever you think. That's why like let's say like people in right-wing politics who necessarily support people who are part of like army and so on, because these people are powerful men who can project fear. You associate women with the same characterization and same stereotypes as well, insofar you are able to do this. The comparative is really simple. In their paradigm, these movies exist and the stereotypical representation still continues to occur. The comparative is who the heck gets to decide how these characters necessarily look like? Who the gets to decide how this character arc would look like? I think at that point of time, the feminist movement gets to decide only in our paradigm, because that is the delta here. That is the comparative. What else do they say you, right? Second idea. Feminist movement as so on, they will get affected, people will pull out and so on. Like just like really just practically think about this, right? Like who the heck goes like, hey, the feminist movement are supporting the character named Devil Wears Prada now. I am out of the feminist movement. This is the tipping point for me. I think literally there is no comparative at a point at which people literally think in terms of people like the feminist movement supporting a few characters, and that really is the tipping point for them to determine if the feminist movement can be good or bad. But secondly, and more importantly, right, insofar that is not the tipping point, insofar this is the thing which makes them really think about if they want to join the movement or not. This again works on things like counter narratives. There are real women out there who necessarily are like the characters necessarily we want to defend in this kind of movie. The fact that they necessarily work in companies in which they are unapologetic. They don't want to be people who are empathetic. They want to get shit done. They are unapologetic in the way they want to function. They're not afraid to fire out people. They're not afraid to lash out on them. I think at that moment of paradigm, they feel extremely left out of the feminist movement when the feminist movement keeps on talking about things that like the feminist movement necessarily needs to be people who are necessarily empathetic and so on, right? You're necessarily excluding those kind of women. Why this comparative is better? Because if their idea is that people will opt out of the feminist movement the moment you do this, that's untrue, because the feminist movement literally never says that women are not supposed to be empathetic. I think the narrative becomes that women can be empathetic and can be fear, mechanisms of fear as well. You can literally be both. I think at that point of paradigm, you don't get the pull out they want to talk about. What is the comparative then, right? You get more opt-in from the people who necessarily do not relate to your empathetical archetype, but also more importantly, you don't get pull-outs because you necessarily do not have to support one thing over the other. They never explain to you why exactly this is a binary, right? Like in our world, why can't we both support Devil Wears Prada at the same point and support Little Women? They say that people necessarily have lesser screen time. Like I don't know how that generally occurs, right? The feminist movement is tremendously wide. I think at that point of paradigm, like if there are two leaders who are getting some sort of screen time, both of them can like literally say that I think Little Women and Devil Wears Prada are both great representations of women and ought to be. That screen time argument doesn't really work. Why that is important then? That means their idea of the movement necessarily failing out and the amount of pullouts which necessarily happen doesn't really stand in this debate because of the fact that they necessarily do not have any sort of proof why you likely cannot support both. What is the comparative then and what are the impacts we get? Firstly, role modeling. There is no engagement with this. Like the people who necessarily think that they are supposed to be always empathetic and cannot never ever be unapologetic for exactly they want, they cannot have a role model in this and necessarily look at movies and necessarily realize that, hey, these people can exist in our paradigm and these people also are like susceptible to getting success. I think that never happens on their paradigm. But also more importantly, men are just like not like always confident they can roll over women in every freaking scenario, right? This can look like both in terms of your board meetings where you think that you have a woman CEO that doesn't, and she would not say anything, you will just get whatever you want, but also in relationship dynamics where you think that women cannot be alpha characters in which they are always supposed to compromise and so on at a point of which you are afraid. And you can imagine women to be coming from an archetype where they can be afraid, right? But thirdly and more importantly, people realize why this counter narrative and why this counter stereotyping that women can be part of leadership roles, because people associate leadership with things like fear of getting shit done. That's the main archetype of how you characterize leader, and you see their skill to be like that. Could not be more proud too.
I thank the speaker very much for their speech, and I now invite the second negative speaker to continue their team's case. Here.
Hello, can I be heard?
Yes, thanks.
All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. You know, I think a funny summary of Gov's case is really just, we want to have the Joker, but for women. And the rationale is really to suggest that, oh, you want to have this counterculture personality that breaks all of the pre-existing stereotypes about what women are meant to be. But like, the wording of the motion is that you get all of those people, and you make them feared. Like people don't like them, they're the villain, they oppress other people. Like if they say that you want to have like some models, like it's kind of, they do this weird thing where they say, if they exist, you have some discussion. but are clear counter-comparative on office to just say, you have a discussion, and they come to the conclusion that, women in power, it's kind of a bad thing. And it's kind of bad because they say like their best example on Gov is they say, Meryl Streep versus Anne Hathaway in The Devil Wears Prada. But in that movie, Meryl Streep, number one, abuses all of her employees, but also forces Anne Hathaway into bulimia and anorexia. Like, I think they kind of forget like the major fact that to be feared is to kind of be terrible. And in general, we're also against a lot of those terrible things. That is to suggest we're against women fighting against other women because it creates toxicity in the workforce. We're against things like the creation of body stereotypes, anorexia, etc. These things ultimately suggest that while they have like, yes, an argument in which they support powerful women, they never prove, firstly, the link about how they actually get society to create women to become powerful, or secondly, why that's worth all of the external actions that are emergent out of fear. So I think just like from this introduction from the get-go, government has a solvency problem in which they can't claim the conclusions they take, but secondly, by explaining it in such a way that they want X, Y, and Z, and they have a major impact on society, they make implicit concessions that if that depiction is bad, it's game-breaking for the feminist movement. They kind of have like two semi-resolutions to this claim, which is to suggest that like, one, at the very least, you at least to some extent have a degree of control if you support it. And that secondly, if you make this happen, even if other people oppress you, you have like some degree of internalization that you're a badass and that's going to be great. So let's debunk this individually and then I'll explain why the unresponded blue material is just demolishing for God. So first of all, let's talk about this like frame of how you have some degree of influence if you support it. So I think the first issue here is kind of to just suggest if they really want to do this whole we wash every issue into debate and all of these issues have already been created, then there's no real margin because if they already exist and their support does nothing, if you say it's a good thing, then nothing changes. If we say it's a bad thing, then nothing changes. I think, of course, there are a degree of change. So I would suggest it would be three things. Number one, there are likely going to be more as these pieces try to pander towards a female and feminist audience. Second of all, is that clearly by supporting it, you give an endorsement, which means that you endorse a lot of these characters' actions as this girl boss, even though they're abusing their employees. And thirdly, of course, when you have women who disagree with these individual actions, they have a dissonance in internalizing it because they feel like the feminist movement and it is a progressive thing to support them, even if they feel naturally repressed. So there's clearly some degree of change. But secondly, even if you don't believe that we change the specific creation, clearly there is a difference by the means by which you create changes. Because presumably, if you don't support something, by definition, you demand change. You disagree and then you suggest that change needs to happen in order for you to have a more representative interpretation. What happens though is on Gov, the premise of it is that we support women being feared, and though there are some problems, we feel like there are a series of improvements. So the issue with them is that they don't have a particular urgency to why Hollywood would want to have a change, especially if their argument is that there's a monetary incentive to attract women, because you already give your support. To suggest that there are potential marginal improvements isn't likely going to affect the bottom line since you already supported them. But secondly, a lot of these marginal improvements aren't going to be able to use a lot of their viscerality because to give a very good comprehensive critique in the media, etc., would be to highlight that this isn't for women, that these characters are made poorly, and therefore to reject by definition and negate a lot of the processes of these female leads. So this ultimately suggests now, even if we're trying to demand change on both sides, the change that they demand is going to be significantly worse in terms of both what change they can get and how they get that change. But secondly, even if you do believe that there is a degree in change and then we're strong enough to make that influence, presumably this just makes our own counterfactual stronger, which is to suggest if we can have things like more female leads, the creation of new films that don't have a lot of these by construction stereotypes that make the feared person not likable, etc., they don't give an argument to why a person who inspires hope, is inspiring, etc., cannot simultaneously be powerful. They just simply suggest that there are pre-existing stereotypes to why women should be weak, but not necessarily why female leads, Wonder Woman, Joe from Little Women also embody those traits. That is to suggest, since these things are emergent about being the center star and not necessarily about being emergent whether you're fearful or inspiring, this ultimately suggests that we can negate a lot of government benefits and still create that creative change. Let's move into the second winning issues. Let's say you don't believe that we can actually change the media as a whole. At the very least, we can change the way that people individually interpret this, because they kind of suggest that, oh, it's about changing general societal narratives, but at the same time saying that society will never change because there are all of these internal structural problems. But I would suggest one of the biggest changes that we can get on op is presumably how these women internalize themselves. So I think there are a series of reasons here. So I think we gave 3 that they don't respond to. The first one was the external imposition. It's very hard to empathize with the villain because other people tell you that villains and people who are feared are bad, and therefore you cannot opt into the feminist movement. Secondly, even if nobody's telling you that, people internally don't want to be perceived as that. While yes, you have all of these people, Umbridge, etc., who might necessarily be seen as powerful. If you think the cost of being powerful is to be hated by your friends, is to be hated by other people, it actually enforces the pre-existing stereotypes because you recognize that there are natural consequences to trying and break those things. But thirdly, I actually think it just distances you from the hero itself. Ultimately, to suggest that you support a lot of these heroes, a lot of these feared people, likely means that you have to see yourself as opposed to a lot of the pre-existing things such as worshipping, such as being things like morally upright, etc. Many people cannot see themselves in both the parallelity, even if they believe they might vibe with some of the things that a very fearful woman might have, which is to suggest that since that they can't create that distinction of government side, presumably people just reject it in its entirety. These 2 things ultimately suggest that not only for the people outside is it going to be worse that you support it as the feminist movement, but even for the people inside, you actually start oppressing people, women, and a lot of their own internal self-image, how they view themselves in the society within it. These 2 things are likely the most important things for the feminist movement and are probably game-breaking for Gov. But thirdly, even if you don't get any change, I just think that these external things are just like massively game-breaking. Like, I don't think like Gov really spends a lot of time engaging in the process of how you would do this. Like, if you had cultural icons such as Cruella de Vil, etc., and all of these popular figures, even if you did it in the best way, in a way that was very palatable, this just makes your own convincing narrative to moderate significantly worse. That is to suggest, if the pre-existing narrative is that feminists are trying to take away your rights and liberties, that they're trying to stop people just because they feel marginally offended, if you're trying to say that these are the people that you're going to start holding up as your cultural icons, presumably that means that just from a narrative perspective, the right gets significantly worse. But secondly, it's also not good roles that you're supporting them. That is to suggest all of these female feared lead and villain needs that were women all got harassed, all had a hard time finding a next job because they were all associated with the previous job that they were having. That is to suggest that even if the margins of the debate are very small, the process that they support on government side is actively detrimental to the feminist movement and the women that they express to play those roles. With that, I'm proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker very much for their speech, and now I invite the third affirmative speaker to conclude the substantive portion of their case. Here.
Hello, am I visible and audible?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. Give me 2 seconds and I'll start. Starting in 3, 2, 1. First, I'll talk about their premise, then I'll establish the framing, and lastly, I'll weigh this round out. Firstly, let's talk about their counterfactual, right? What they want to do is show women as strong and inspiring confidence in others. I think, firstly, if the framing that we get in LO is that Hollywood caricaturizes things and paints them in extremely unrealistic ways, it's fair to assume that even portrayals in their world will be caricatures. So the same harms they talk about on our side exist on their side as well. Women are shown as being ridiculously strong, extremely unrealistic, inspiring confidence even in situations where it shouldn't have been inspired. This draws literally the same ridicule from people who oppose the feminist movement. Now, it's an exaggerated portrayal of women that is completely contradictory to the existing narrative that depicts them to be submissive. And here's the key link as to why our comparative is still marginally better. People engage in discourse with you when you listen to their side, listen to their beliefs, and then give them reasons from side without contradicting them at every single instance. Our narrative is co-optable in the sense that you can be a stay-at-home mother who has the potential to evict fear, but it's much more difficult to convince people that you can be completely strong and independent under the exact same circumstances, which is why it's still marginally better on our side of the house. Yes, you can hope for more women to be given female leads, but it doesn't happen to the scale that you want. Most of Hollywood still doesn't want movies like that to come out, which is why the number of movies that come out, even if they give a few examples, is still relatively small compared to like the vast number of movies that do come out in general. What Hollywood does love to do, however, is create controversy, to create discussions, because that's how they promote their films. Even if the character may be evil, it doesn't imply that there is no empathy one can have for the character. And that's that's literally what Hollywood wants. They want those Reddit forums asking, is XYZ really bad? Or did they actually have to do this based on because of the circumstances they were in? So Ops Mech here is just people don't empathize. We tell you that movie producers have an incentive to create characters you can empathize with, because that's how they generate more discussions regarding the movie, and that's how the movie itself makes more money. But secondly, in terms of always being the villain, right? I think it's important to note this is not likely to always be true. Literally, the examples given in the info slide, two out of the three characters are not objective villains. Okay, sure, they sometimes do bad things, but the reason they do bad things is because there's no other way to get out of the situation they are stuck in. They say to be feared is to be terrible. Maybe true in some contexts. If this is a horrible portrayal, narratives surrounding women will still say negative, even on their side. The fact that when the feminist movement actively engages with this by saying it's fine to portray this woman this way, they inherently get a bigger seat at the discussion table in terms of how they want to portray women. They say Hollywood wouldn't want to change, but the marginal improvements DLO concedes to are important, because in the absence of any creation of reaction from the feminist movement, these sort of movies still exist in their world. There is no way to actually control the sort of content that comes out of them. Things like Girl Boss might be bad from a woke debate room perspective, but there's a reason why these methods are being used by women. It's because nothing else to improve their circumstances is working. It's because they have no choice to act this way. And when we highlight this stuff in movies, that's when we actually talk about this stuff. That's when we talk about, okay, this might be a problem, but we definitely need to talk about, we definitely need to break some sort of changes to the system overall. I'm going to do then two things now. First, the frame, then weighing implementations and outcomes. First, what is the societal perception surrounding how women ought to act in a particular context? I think the general discussions amongst progressive groups around giving more agency to choose how women can act as they want. The way to do that is by showing that women are unique in how they operate. Note this debate is not a binary, in the sense that by supporting portrayals that portray women as a sort of fear, it doesn't mean that the feminist movement is not allowed to support women being portrayed in different ways. If the response here is from NEC is that this comes off as hypocritical, firstly, it's not always bad to be hypocritical in certain circumstances if you don't have any options. But secondarily, these opponents who got against the feminist movement literally already call you hypocrites. They call you fools for trying to push for things that should be rights for your community, but they feel you don't deserve. I think the key thing here is to show that women as multidimensional characters, because that's how you as multidimensional people in general, because that's how you try to convince people that there is more to women than conservatives believe to be true in status quo. Why is fear something that has to then be displayed? The dominant narratives used by opponents of the feminist movements are along the line of women are supposed to be submissive, should not work, etc. So here's the comparative. If Op is saying that things like backlash are going to occur, that men are going to paint women as being evil and horrible, this already exists in status quo. That's to say, conservatives literally say women can't achieve anything, they deserve to stay at home. This inherently stagnates the feminist movement overall in both worlds. So the important thing to consider here is exactly how much worse does this become, right? If women are already told they have to stay at home, how much worse can this become? The extent of the scale is something that's extremely unclear in opposition. There are two ways you can deal with this backlash. Either you can A, do nothing, which is their model, in which case the oppression on women is still something that remains quite large in scale, but note that these movies will still be made again and again. There isn't even a feedback loop where the feminist movement gets a way to engage with them. Like, that harm still exists. It's still super bad. But the second way to do this is you can issue counter narratives to actively try to engage with the idea, try to mitigate the scale of the backlash and force people to get on the discussion table with you in terms of why having these diverse perspectives is valid and the idea that they're being represented is good. Not being a person who evokes fear in others does not imply that the person is inherently evil. Note a large chunk of the time in these movies and shows, they talk about the circumstances that force the woman to act this way. The fact that there may be no other way for you to be able to succeed because the patriarchy is so desperate to lock you into the roles that they have deemed you to be suited for. These counter narratives deal with backlash on our side in the sense that they say people who are on the fence over whether to support feminism or not. This highlights specific issues faced by the feminist movement. It highlights why in certain circumstances women are forced to act this way. This generates more awareness on these specific issues of this community, creates awareness in a way that people who otherwise do not know these circumstances exist that make women act this way. These circumstances are made visible, and this is good. I want to be clear. The backlash analysis from me here does not flip their case. It mitigates it, however. The importance of a counter narrative then becomes extremely important. The way you get people to react to stuff is by endorsing a statement and saying it's a valid counter narrative. This forces people to engage with you when they otherwise wouldn't, and even amongst conservative communities forces discussions on why are women being forced to become evil? Like, why is that portrayal even happening in the first place? What's the weighing of all of this? Firstly, let's talk about societal change. change, right? They say sources of fear will be like depicted in a negative light. We think this is fine. Even in cases where women are shown as the objective women, the way Hollywood works in order to create more drama, in order to create more controversy, in order to gain more viewers, is to show a backstory for the villains that explains why they were forced to act this way. This again illustrates the circumstances that created the situation that we're in. They say characters can never be constructed in a nuanced way and still evoke fear. I want to note here there is a difference between how characters in the film perceive them and how the viewer perceives them. The character may evoke fear amongst other movie characters, as was done in The Devil Wears Prada, but the viewer gets a perspective that is more nuanced and multidimensional. Even if this is not true in all cases, in the cases where it is true, we get to talk about these experiences, and that's something that's extremely crucial here. You get more power and agency as the feminist movement to show how these characters are written. This is absent in their world. If you don't actively support or hate on this, you get no way to actually engage with the narratives. If you're passive as the feminist movement, nothing changes. The harms that exist still continue to exist. But in terms of negative stereotypes, right, they say these tend to become worse. I want to note that the existing stereotypes surrounding women don't center on the fact they are fearful. They center on the fact that women have predetermined roles that involve being submissive. That's the whole point of having more counter narratives coming out, so you can challenge these existing stereotypes. I don't know why this is a negative stereotype in and of itself, if we've already given you reasons for why it can be interpreted in positive ways, right? But in terms of the feminist movement like falling apart and losing power, right, I don't know why women decide to leave the feminist movement because of this. The mechanism from op is women don't want to be portrayed as evil, and hence they want to join the movement. Why is this the tipping point to opt out? The feminist movement literally still deals with all of the oppression women are facing. It's the only collectivizing global platform that's looking out for their best interests and fighting for their rights in places no other group is. That incentive is why you stay with the feminist movement overall. But lastly, in terms of getting women to more positions of power, right, it's important to have that sort of feel for aura. The ability to be unapologetic, the ability to get shit done is important because it's a trait that's valued amongst people in leaderships. We want a role model for women who want to succeed. The fact that they have to take drastic steps in order to succeed is something you want to highlight with these movies. And this is good because it's a depiction of the world we actually live in, a world that demands women to evoke fear if they want to succeed, a world that feeds on them and tells them they have to be strong. They want to be given, if they want to be given opportunities, otherwise the patriarchy will go on and deny this. And that is the link as to how we get societal support. Let me be clear, supporting this isn't the tipping point that doesn't get women positions of power. Supporting this does not result in women opting out. What this does is creates a counter narrative that challenges existing norms. For these reasons, proposed.
Okay, I thank the speaker very much for their speech and now invite the third negative speaker to conclude the substantive portion of the negative case. Here. Oh, and I believe the live stream should be stopped.
Yeah, I'm just double
right?
checking that this is no live stream, right?
I see like a recording thing up there.
That's just live.
Do you want us to wait a second for the live stream to reboot?
I think it's back up already, actually.
You could just wait 1 second, sorry, please. Thank you.
Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah, it's like...
My bad. Sorry, we spilled the coffee. Close the door behind you. Are we good? Thumbs up.
I think it, yeah, looks like it's up.
Yep, you're good.
Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, and 1. 3 things in the speech. First, the marginal change in this debate. Secondly, what actually was the exchange in terms of which side is solving the perceived problem better. And thirdly, the externalities that Gov has really no response to. Let's first take a look at the prerequisite, which is what actually changes. Gov has a response to us because we say they produce bad narratives. They say these movies already exist. Therefore, the narratives are not mutually exclusive because they'll also exist on our side. This is a nonsensical response, and we took this down very heavily since we understand that this has the potential to be misrepresented. The first is that we showed very clearly that this takes on a new political dimension since the feminist movement, which is a credible signal for what feminists and women believe to be themselves, now take on an actively bad narrative. Hence, when they take on this narrative, the amount of bad narratives purported to be about feminist movement, about women, drastically increases. And the second thing was we said there's a change in both what gets platformed, so what the public is shown more, but also in terms of demand, what movies tend to be created more. And we said, given that they agree these bad narratives, can be potentially bad, we say presumably marketing it more is much worse. And so this is just to show that their response, trying to wash the entire debate, doesn't make sense, because if it was true that these bad narratives would still exist, then it should also be true that if this is a positive representation, these movies would still be existing. So just to make it clear that this is not a meaningful response within the debate. The second thing is actually the byplay of exchanges. So we showed that when their claim is that women get a seat at the table, they have to overcome 3 hurdles set up by opposition bench, and they've overcome none of them. The first is, in terms of interpretation, that people will get the right message from the film and from the feminist movement, but they do not successfully do so. The best proof Gov gets from this is, first of all, they say, people tend to respect people they fear. And we say they may do that, but they will typically hate them more. And beyond that, that they will see negative reasons that override the fear, such as the gut primal reaction, which not only are stronger reasons than what Gov provides, but directly respond to that reason. In addition, we also show that even if there's a possibility that the feminist movement gets a seat at the table, they never met this. They just say, once you speak on it, you get a seat at the table, which we say you can still speak on it, but what Gov is unable to do is criticize it, such that if Gov concedes there are some harms, they're never able to improve it. So our side is able to improve these harms. I don't know what the seat at the table is. Like when the feminist movement speaks up on it, like a chair suddenly rises beneath it, like what actually happens? There's no mechanism by which this happens in any case. And so they cannot meet the threshold that the interpretation is good for their side. And what we show is that the interpretation does not just not happen, but is actively bad for women, and that it is negative to put women in power. It is bad to promote them. They're not trustworthy within the workplace. And hence, even if they could be handling power correctly, our problem is that they're not trustworthy with power. Secondly, we say that women don't want to self-identify with this. So even if it's possible that this is successful at convincing people about women, if the issue is that women themselves don't want to opt into this narrative because it is distasteful, not only is this bad, one, because this narrative gets no traction, doesn't actually influence people at all, but number two is that it makes it harder to associate with the feminist movement, which means even if you believe that neither side makes a meaningful narrative change, the tangible change may just be the feminist movement gets weaker in a lot of other ways that are very important to women, such as the ability to vote, the ability to self-identify as a feminist, and pass on other narratives that we both agree to be unambiguously good, as well as the ability to make things better for other women through funding it and supporting it. So this second part shows that even if they're correct in showing that the interpretation is possibly good, they never show that people will identify with it, especially if they never respond to all the pre-existing stuff that all your options to support feared women are the particularly sexist, particularly bad, particularly misogynist depictions that Hollywood creates that Gov is forced to deal with. The final thing we show is that our solution is comparatively better. We give you a whole host of reasons for why heroes are capable of inspiring people and taking the lead, as well as being able to show that women can be in positions of power. Remember, their benefit is not being feared is good. Their benefit is being feared indirectly leads to traits that are desirable, such as being a leader, which we say is much more directly targeted for in our counterfactual, and it's much easier for this to become viral, for this to become popular, because it's much easier to empathize, much easier to identify, and hence our solution, even if their solution is good, is just much better than their solution. It's clear. We negate. Gov cannot win this debate.
Okay, I thank the speaker very much for their speech. Now to conclude the debate, I invite the affirmative reply speaker. Here.
All right. Am I audible?
Yes, thanks.
All right. Three, two, one. There are so much things which are inexclusive to both of the sides of the debate. Extremely unsure why the feminist movement can just really stand up and say that, hey, we support both Joey from Little Women and Meryl Streep from Devil Wears Prada because those show the diversification at a point at which women occur. At that point of time, if you really imagine that you can literally do both of the things, that you can support empathetic characters, but at the same point of time, you can also support women who are sources of fear, you literally get all the benefits which opposition talks about, but also more importantly, they never deal with the harms which they really point out, right? What are the kind of things they point out? They point out that Hollywood itself is so stereotypical that they will do this in a worst way possible. We tell you the marginal change is only possible at a point at which the feminist movement literally says that we are supporting these kind of fear, sources of fear, and that's exactly why we want to create better characters. Their response to this is there is no mech. If that is true, we necessarily have told you that at the moment of which women necessarily don't say anything about it, there is no possible way they can be part of the decision-making process of the way these characters are written. But secondly, and more importantly, right, they assert and at best assert that the only thing you can do is either choose to support characters from Joey to Little Women, or you can make heroes or you can make characters or can support characters as sources to women. This binary cannot exist just because Ateneo says it, right? At that point of time, you really have to think this binary exists as well or not. You literally can have heroes on both of the paradigms. The difference is this, right? What the feminist movement chooses to do with all those portrayals which are being created, right? The moment we say that the binary then, like the tipping point then becomes, you support this because you think that you can use this to make counter narratives. What is their argument here, right? They say that you cannot make, that the fear has nothing exclusive to it at a point at which we cannot advocate for it. What is exclusive to fear? Firstly, they assert that fear necessarily means that you always have to be immoral. We literally challenge this. We are extremely unsure that fear always have to mean immorality, right? But secondly, and more importantly, we really want to break the stereotype because people misinterpret as all fearful actions being immoral. We want to educate people that women are being fearful or are being sources of fear because of their own lived experiences. The only possible tangible change you can get, and at least the probability still exists in our paradigm, even though our mech could be extremely slow because no mech exists on their side, right? But thirdly, and more importantly, the reason why we need less support for characters like Little Women in like Joey and so on, because we already portray women as people who are inspiring, as people who are supposed to be empathetic and caring, right? Like imagine how like people like stay-at-home mothers are being celebrated. Imagine how like people, super moms are being celebrated because they can work at the office but also take care of the household, right? All of those things literally exist in the society. What doesn't exist, however, is that when women choose to be, they can get rid of that empathetic career archetype and can be literal hardline leaders. That's important because people want that character to be there, right? We are extremely unsure how hope and inspire and all of those kind of archetype literally leads to that, right? You literally want your leaders to people who can literally advocate fear, because at that point of time, you want them to take stances which are like problematic and stances which are tremendously hardline, right? Things like being okay with firing out people because the company is going through a loss. Being a leader at that point of time, deciding to choose one thing over the other, even though you're leaving out your vulnerable things, right? All of those things are people literally what they want to see in their own leaders. You do not associate those kind of archetypes with women because there are literally no narratives in which you always think about these people are supposed to be empathetic, and that is why you don't think they can be like able leaders and so on. That's the counter narrative we want to fight. Panel, the comparative and the tipping point is really marginal in this debate, and more often than not, whatever the benefits which accrue out from their narrative literally exist in our paradigm as well. Secondly, and more importantly, they literally have no mechanism of why people leave this movement as a whole, right? They're depending on their argument about political dimensions literally changing. They will show why women supporting a certain kind of film characters becomes the tipping point for these people. But also more importantly, they also never show to you why can you not support both kind of characters, right? For all of those reasons, so proud to propose.
Okay, I thank the speaker very much for their speech, and I thank all speakers again for an enjoyable debate.